Daniel stood at the sealed emergency hatch, watching the amber warning lights pulse across its surface while 3 armed officers waited behind Lieutenant Sarah for him to explain himself. She told him plainly that this section was closed, that the rescue window had already passed, and that he needed to return to the passenger deck immediately. Daniel didn't move. He looked past her toward the hatch, where the display showed a slow, steady decline in the number of life signs still registering inside, and asked her a question instead of answering hers. "How long until you vent the section?" Sarah hesitated, thrown by the calm in his voice. She reminded him that the corridor beyond the hatch had been classified unsurvivable, and that command had authorized a full purge within the hour to keep the failure from spreading. Daniel nodded slowly as though he'd expected exactly that answer, and said the sensors were wrong about how much time those people actually had. It wasn't a challenge. It came out the way a man might mention it was going to rain. A junior officer had already flagged the disturbance, and Captain Varric arrived at the edge of the corridor pulling up Daniel's file as a matter of routine, the way he would for any civilian causing trouble near a restricted section. What he found looked almost aggressively unremarkable. Civilian certification. Emergency systems consultant. No current military rank. The kind of file that told him nothing except that this passenger had no business being anywhere near a sealed hatch during an active emergency. Daniel, meanwhile, kept talking to Sarah, not to argue but to make her see what he was seeing. The ship's rescue model, he explained, assumed nobody could cross the damaged corridor before the structure gave way completely, but that model had been built around her species' heat tolerance, not his. Sarah didn't have an answer for that. It was the first small crack in a set of assumptions she hadn't known she was standing on. She asked how he could possibly know there was still a way through, and Daniel said simply that he'd seen a collapse like this one before. That single sentence caught Varric's attention. A civilian systems consultant didn't talk like a man who had personally walked through structural failures, and it was enough to make him look closer at the file in his hand. Buried beneath the civilian record was an old clearance code that shouldn't have belonged to a systems consultant at all. He requested access to whatever sat behind it, and the system returned a single line. Restricted operational record. He authorized it anyway, still standing at the edge of the corridor, still half listening to Sarah trying to reason with a man who wouldn't back down. The section's automatic purge was drawing closer, and Sarah, working from the only information she had, finally ordered 2 of her officers to restrain Daniel and remove him. He didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, calm in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with knowing that every second spent arguing was a second someone below them didn't have. The officers were a step away from taking hold of his arms when Varric's restricted access cleared, and 2 words appeared at the top of the file. Orison evacuation. He went still, reading further while the soldiers closed the last of the distance to Daniel, and then his voice cut through the corridor, sharp enough that every officer froze mid-motion. Everyone back. Sarah turned toward him, confused, and found her captain staring at Daniel with an expression she had never seen on him before. Nobody moved. He didn't explain himself, not yet. He simply asked Daniel one question, ignoring everyone else in the corridor. "How many do you believe are alive?" "At least 6, Daniel said. Varric looked toward the sealed hatch, then back at him. "What do you need?" While engineers began preparing an access route, Sarah pulled her captain aside and asked quietly who exactly this man was. Varric told her what his own military academy had taught years ago as a case study in human crisis doctrine. The Orison orbital habitat had suffered catastrophic structural failure during a conflict long before either of them had served, and when the official rescue effort ended, one human rescue specialist had gone back inside anyway. Not once. Several times. He had pulled dozens of civilians out of a station that was already being written off as lost, and the detail that made the incident remembered wasn't how many people he saved. It was that many of them had belonged to the opposing side, and Daniel had never once asked which uniform they wore before deciding whether they could walk. Sarah asked if Varric believed he could do it again. Varric shook his head slightly. "I don't believe that," he said. "I believe that if he says 6 people are alive, he's already decided he's going after them." Daniel entered the damaged section with Sarah choosing, without being asked, to go in beside him. He didn't move like a soldier clearing a battlefield. He moved like someone reading a building, listening to the way heat shifted through the walls, rerouting a pressure valve with tools that weren't designed for it, keeping Sarah steady when her suit alarm started screaming warnings neither of them had time to fully process. As they pushed deeper, the pressure differential across the corridor kept narrowing, and Daniel adjusted their path twice without stopping to explain why, trusting that Sarah would follow. They found 5 survivors together and guided them back toward the access point, and Daniel stopped. Sarah told him the sensors showed nothing else down there. But Daniel remembered a small discrepancy from earlier, a maintenance barrier that had been manually sealed from the inside, not blown shut like the rest of the corridor. He didn't ask permission. He went back in. Behind the barrier was the ship's young maintenance apprentice, injured and unable to move, with the section now minutes from full isolation. Sarah calculated out loud that carrying the apprentice would slow them down enough to make the return dangerous. Daniel didn't answer her with words. He simply lifted the apprentice, and Sarah realized watching him that she was looking at the exact thing described in a file she hadn't fully believed until now. The corridor partially collapsed behind them on the way out, and Daniel used what he'd noticed earlier about the emergency conduits to force a temporary pressure release, buying just enough time to reach the hatch before it sealed for good. All 6 survivors made it out. There was no cheering, no crowd, only a quiet exhale that moved through the corridor as people realized it was over. Varric looked at Daniel, then at the apprentice still gripping his sleeve, and said nothing for a long moment. Sarah picked up Daniel's dropped equipment bag and handed it back to him, asking why his public file only listed him as an emergency systems consultant. Daniel shrugged slightly. "That's what I do now," he said, and it was clear from the way he said it that he had never thought of Orizon as a legend. He had only ever thought of it as something that needed doing. Varric ordered the ship's emergency protocols updated that same day, so that future human personnel would no longer be assessed purely through models built for a different species' limits, and so that in any unresolved rescue, the judgment of a qualified specialist on the ground would be weighed before a section was ever written off as lost. Weeks later, Sarah pulled up Daniel's file again out of habit. The restricted record was still there, exactly as it had been, but a new entry had been added beneath it. The official report credited Daniel alone with saving 6 lives aboard the Halvern. He had requested a correction. It now read, simply Joint Rescue Operation, because Sarah had gone in with him, and he hadn't seen any reason to leave her name out of it. She sat with that for a while, understanding finally what her captain had understood the moment he opened that file. It was never that people needed to stand back when Daniel Mercer moved forward. It was that whenever everyone else stepped back, he was usually the one who didn't. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Humanity's Armada for more HFY Sci-Fi stories. Until the next adventure, take care.